amount of water taken in was an enormous 2.2 billion gallons per day, a square mile 12 feet deep every day. The reef mitigation is linked to the adverse effects of the cooling water discharge, which created a turbidity plume. And this turbidity plume has been implicated in the cause of a substantial reduction in the size of the San Onofre kelp forest and the fish and invertebrates and algae associated with it. The California Coastal Act requires mitigation for marine impacts, and the California Coastal Commission, or the CCC, is responsible for implementing the Coastal Act. As mitigation for these marine impacts of songs, the CCC required the power company, Southern California Edison, to construct an artificial reef that creates a minimum of 150 acres of kelp forest habitat to compensate for the losses of kelp and kelp bed fishes and invertebrates. And second, to provide funding for scientific oversight and monitoring of the mitigation project that was independent of the power company. This slide gives an overview of the project site, which is in North San Diego County. The artificial reef is shown in the yellow rectangle, and the power company is shown here. The reef was constructed in two phases. Phase one was completed in October of 1999, was about 22 acres and consisted of 56 quarter-acre modules of different cover and substrate type, all low relief. And the results of the 5-year monitoring of phase one were used to design phase two, which was 152 acres of low relief quarry rock that was completed in September of 2008. And together, phase one and phase two add up to 174 acres, which was designated the Wheeler North Reef, and Wheeler North was a pioneer in kelp forest ecology. There are definite performance standards which we use as a measuring stick to evaluate whether the Wheeler North Reef compensates for the impacts caused to the kelp forest by songs. There are two kinds of performance standards that we use. We have absolute standards that are measured as fixed values only on Wheeler North, and then we have relative standards that are measured relative to two natural reference reefs that have a structure similar to the mitigation reef. Okay, the absolute performance standards, the requirement is that the Wheeler North Reef must meet each of the absolute performance standards in a given year for that year to count towards mitigation credit. And the evaluation of each absolute standard is based on the value for the current year or a 4-year running average that is based on calculated from the current year and the 3 previous years, whichever is higher. And the rationale for these absolute standards is that they're based on the average annual losses caused by songs, and these were determined in a study that was started in '78 and went through '86 to determine the impacts. And all of them need to be met to ensure that the lost resources are mitigated or replaced. Here's a list of the 4 absolute performance standards. There's a standard for hard substrate that requires that at least 90% of the exposed hard substrate that was initially installed must remain available for attachment to reef biota. There's a standard for giant kelp that requires a minimum sustainable acreage of 150 acres of medium to high density giant kelp, which is an important foundation species in the kelp forest. There's a standard for fish standing stock based on, again, on the impacts. The standing stock of fish at the mitigation reef needs to be at least 28 tons, and then a final standard is that the important functions of the reef shall not be impaired by undesirable or invasive benthic species. There are, as I said, there are relative performance standards, And the requirement is that the Wheeler North Reef must meet as many relative standards as the lowest performing reference reef in a given year for that year to count towards mitigation credit. We evaluate this by looking at Wheeler North and the reference reefs with respect to each other to determine whether they meet each relative standard, and then we total up the number of relative standards met by the three reefs, and we compare them. And the rationale for doing this is that by doing this, we require Wheeler North to meet at least as many of the relative standards as the natural reefs, but we don't require it to consistently outperform the natural reefs. There are 11 relative performance standards. There are 5 that have to do with the benthic community of algae and invertebrates and looking at abundance percent cover and species richness. There are also 5 standards for fish, including the density of adult, which we call resident reef fish, and young of year density, and then fish species richness, and we measure fish reproductive rates and fish production. And then there's a final standard called food chain support, which basically links the benthos to the fish, and we determine how the benthos supports reef fish, providing food for reef fish. Okay, this is an overview of the Wheeler North Reef. The little purple squares are the Phase 1 reef, and then the green are the polygons for the 152 acres of the larger reef. We monitor annually to evaluate the performance standards. There are 92 stations, sampling stations on the reef, and they're shown by these little black lines. They're measuring 50 meters by 20 meters. As you can see, they're broadly distributed across the reef. And we identify each station by differential GPS coordinate and a compass heading. And so we go back to the same places every time over the time series. And we have similar designs placed on the 2 reference reefs and similar sampling effort. Okay, well, a note about SONG's mitigation requirements. As I said, the goal is to replace the kelp forest resources lost by the operation of the power plant. And 1 year of mitigation credit is given for each year that the Wheeler North Reef meets the performance standards. And the fulfillment of the reef mitigation requirement will occur when the number of years of mitigation and credit accrued by Wheeler North Reef equals the total years of operation of SONG's units 2 and 3. Okay, here's a summary of where we are right now for mitigation compliance. And so we've been monitoring, well, we're in the 9th year of monitoring, but we've been monitoring, this has the 8 years of monitoring results. So all of the relative standards have been met. The hard substrate standard has been met, and the invasive and undesirable species standard has been met. Kelp standard was met 6 out of the 8 years, but, and so just a note, so green means it's met, red means it's not met. And however, the fish standing stock standard has not been met in any of the years. So the operation of the power plant, it shut down in 2012, but it was in operation for about 31, 32 years. One of them started before the other. So they need at least 30 years of credit, and to date they have received none. And it is solely because of the failure to meet the fish standing stock standard. Okay, here's a time series of the fish standing stock. So initially when the reef was put in, there was a lot of immediate attraction of fish, and then abundances went down. And pretty much there was a peak in abundance in 2014. So on the West Coast, there was this thing called the blob. It was an unusually warm water, not a typical El Nino. And there was a big increase, but following that, there was a decline. I think this year, I think there's going to be another decline in the standing stock. So it's pretty clear that Wheeler North has failed to consistently support a fish standing stock of 28 tons. Well, we we think that the fish standing stock is dependent in part upon the size of the reef, its topography, and rock coverage. The Wheeler North Reef is currently at 174 acres. It's a low relief reef, less than a meter in profile, and it averages about 48% cover of a hard substrate. And really the question is this 174 acres of low relief, 48% rock coverage, enough to sustain 28 tons of fish over the long term? It doesn't look like it from the previous slides. Annual monitoring that was initiated in 2000 at the Phase 1 reef, coupled with a targeted monitoring or sampling that we did in 2014 on a higher relief reef, provides the quantitative data that we need to evaluate that question. Okay, so this slide addresses the issue of reef size. The two symbols on here are the reference reefs, actually. Oops. So barn kelp is in blue, and San Mateo kelp is just immediately to the south of the reef. And the plot on the left shows fish standing stock scaled to 174 acres, the size of the mitigation reef, the artificial mitigation reef. And what you can see is it's very clear that at 174 acres, these natural reefs do not consistently support a 28-ton standing stock. Barn kelp, if you actually scale the standing stock to the actual size of the reef, you can see that the larger reef, barn kelp, actually meets the 28-ton standard in all but one of the years. San Mateo does not. It's a smaller reef. And there may be some complications with its proximity to the artificial reef. Okay. So larger reefs support greater fish standing stock, so reef size is important. And then this summarizes the data from the Phase 1 reef that we started monitoring in 2000. And this is the rock modules, 3 coverages, 41%, 63%, and 81%. So the 41% is close to what the actual Wheeler North Reef is right now. And you can see that it's very clear that the higher coverage that you have, the more standing stock that you have. So the low relief, which is pretty much close to the current design of the artificial reef, only meets the standing stock standard 1 out of the 12 years that we sampled. And the high relief meets it 8 out of the 12, and the medium relief meets it 3 out of the 12 years that we have been sampling. And then in 2014, we went to 2 nearby high relief reefs that were between 2 and 3 meters in relief. And we compared this is just biomass, grams per meter square. We didn't convert it to tons or anything. And then we compared the fish biomass to near surrounding low relief areas that were around 50% cover. And so what we found was that fish biomass in areas of high relief was on average 5 to 10 times greater than that in the adjacent areas of low relief. Okay, so from our independent studies, we concluded that the present configuration of the reef, 174 acres, low relief, 48% rock coverage, is not sufficient to consistently meet the performance standards for fish standing stock. And this is kind of supported by the limited time series that we have now, 8-9 years. And the question really remains is how much additional reef do you need to meet the 28-ton standard? And so the approach we used for estimating the additional reef, we used the data from the Phase 1 reef and the nearby high relief reefs to predict how many tons of fish would be supported on the existing 174 acres over the long term with a 95% confidence. And that number was 13.5 tons, so there's a 14.5 ton deficit. And the same data were used to predict the number of additional acres that we'd need to support the additional tonnage going on into the future. So these calculations or modeling was done for 3 low relief designs, the 41%, the 63%, and the 81%, and a 1 high relief design. So this slide shows the results of those calculations or modeling studies. So for the low relief reef, you need about 200 acres of additional reef at 41%. And if you had a low relief but high rock cover, you'd need about half of that, about 105 acres, and then the medium cover relief is somewhere in between. And then for the high relief, you only need 30 acres, but it has to be 100% cover. And the amount of rock for the high relief is about 6 times the amount of rock for the 200 acres of low relief. And so all of these, we did a calculation for 99%. If you have a 99% confidence, you need bigger areas, but we chose the 95%. Okay, so to conclude, I just tell you what we're doing in the future. So we're continuing with the independent monitoring of the Wheeler North Reef as required by the CCC Coastal Development Permit. And then we've used this modeling that we have done, the CCC scientists, and we've given those over to the power company, and they pretty much have taken our recommendations, and they are in the process of designing a mitigation, based on the results of our sampling and analysis, so that the fish stock of 28 tons can be supported. And then the current plan is to construct 209 acres of low relief, 41% cover, and that's going to be deployed sometimes in 2019-20. And the current level of monitoring that we have is going to be continued a minimum of 3 years following deployment of the additional reef. Thanks.
Well, we have time for 1 or 2 questions. For clarification, the failure to meet the standard was because not big enough. The fish biomass.
Right.
It wasn't that the reef isn't working; it's that it didn't hit the target.
The reef's working, and if I actually look at the biomass density, it's similar on the artificial reef and the 2 natural reefs. It's just not big enough. Yeah.
So I have a question. Does it matter like what species of fish is located on the reef? It seems like when you have high relief, you usually have larger species and you have larger biomass. Does it matter? I guess I know you guys are adding more low relief, but I didn't know if it mattered on species for the size of or the amount of biomass that would equal that 28 tons.
Most of the species composition on the high relief and the low relief, I mean, high is, not super high, but there are similar species. It's all geared to kelp forest fish, so it's a very, similar species composition. So you're not getting a lot bigger fish necessarily, on the high relief.
Chris, you can ask your question, it'll come off your time.
Well, it's sort of similar to that question in that was there concern with going with the high relief structure that it might concentrate fishing effort?
That was a concern, but our preference would be to have a larger low relief structure because the kelp didn't make it 2 years out of the 8 years, and so if you have a bigger reef, then you're going to increase the probability that you're going to meet the kelp standard because you got to meet both of those. Yeah.
Thank you. So our next speaker is faculty member here at the University of South Florida.